David moved swiftly. The water reached his knees, its murky flow carrying splinters, debris, and the scent of dampness. The air felt heavier than usual. It was the gas. The Hemming house stood apart, slightly lower than the others. Old, dilapidated, with a sagging porch. Its basement was deeper than the rest. David knew this. He still remembered the time, many years ago, when he had hauled out an old wood stove from there. Back then, he was in uniform, with a helmet and an oxygen tank on his back. Now, he wore a faded jacket and held a flashlight. The street hummed with anxiety. A siren wailed somewhere. Water splashed into open car windows, and shouts echoed across the yard. But here, in this dead-end alley, it was quiet. Only the heavy breathing of the water and the metallic trembling of pipes in the house could be heard. David stepped onto the porch, its rotten boards creaking under his weight but holding firm. The door yielded to his shoulder with a sharp crack. Inside, it was dark and damp, the air thick with mustiness. He felt his way deeper, towards the stairs, and immediately sensed it, the sharp, nose-burning smell of gas. Breathing became harder. The basement stairs began behind a narrow door at the end of the hallway. The steps were slippery with water. He turned on his flashlight. The beam illuminated the floor, almost ankle-deep in water, and a concrete wall covered in green mold. He descended carefully. The steps were slippery and worn, one creaking underfoot. At the bottom, the water reached almost to his waist. The stairs disappeared into the gloom. Above, pipes rattled, one shaking violently. A faint, almost invisible vapor escaped from a joint. Gas. He heard a sound. A dull thud, not a splash or a gurgle. Like someone gasping? David froze, listening. Silence. Then again, a gasp. Weak, faltering, as if breath was fading. He swung the flashlight to the right, a shadow, a quick movement. Then, a figure. An animal. A dog. It didn't bark or move. It just stared. Its eyes caught the light, dull, without shine. Gray, dirty, as if covered in mud. Tied to a radiator jetting from the wall, a rope dug into its neck. The water had almost reached its muzzle. The dog stood with its nose pressed against the rusty metal, breathing softly. Barely. A pit bull. David recognized it immediately. Not young. Thin as a skeleton, ribs visible under its skin. It didn't shiver or whine, just waited. Without anger. Without fear. David crouched, holding the flashlight high. The water chilled his knees. He slowly reached out his hand. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, barely hearing himself. "What are you doing here?" The dog didn't respond, only slightly twitched an ear. David examined the rope. The knot was tight. A simple household cord, embedded in the wet fur. It looked old. Not a recent improvisation. Tied long ago. A pipe in the ceiling vibrated loudly, threateningly. Somewhere outside, a door slammed, and the house seemed to shudder. The flashlight flickered. The gas intensified, almost stinging his eyes. David looked up. Minutes left. Minutes before it all blew up. He knew how these things went. He'd seen it before. There was no turning back. Either leave quickly or... He looked at the dog again. The pit bull didn't beg or plead, just stared. And that was enough. David took one last look at the pipe. It rattled and shook as if about to burst from the wall. The gas smell grew stronger, and the sounds confirmed time was running out. If that pipe burst, the house could explode. He couldn't be sure how many seconds were left. Time slipped away with every drop that trickled down the old wooden steps, with every movement of the water rising around his legs. But in his eyes, the dog. And he knew he couldn't leave it there. He slid down the wet stairs, almost losing his balance. Seconds ticked away. But he saw it, the gray, dirty body pressed against the radiator. The pit bull, bound by a rope, stood knee-deep in icy water that had almost reached its muzzle. The dog didn't bark. It just stared. In its eyes, there was no fear, only resolve. As if it had already faced its struggle. "Can't leave it here," David told himself, reaching for the rope. He felt his heart race faster, the cold water in the basement engulfing his legs. With every movement, he knew time was almost up. The sky was a canvas of clouds, and the fog gathering in the corners of this flooded space only added to the tension. He pressed his hand to his chest, feeling the tremor. This wasn't just about the dog's life, it was his moral choice. He could just leave, abandon it. But if he left, if he didn't do this now, it would die. And with it, everything worth fighting for. His fingers quickly untied the knots, barely feeling the rope's fabric. The water was up to his knees, his legs slipping, but he didn't stop. Minutes felt like eternity until he broke the last knot and freed the animal. The dog no longer needed to be tied. Now it was free. On the collar was the dog's name, Maxwell. "Nice to meet you," David said with a smile. David lifted the pit bull, its rough body fitting easily in his arms. He struggled to lift the dog onto an old cabinet in the corner of the basement, and it clung to it, shivering but not falling. The water, surging in the basement, rose higher, almost reaching the dog's muzzle, and he had to hold it as if it were the only thing left. At that moment, a sharp crack echoed. A stream of gas burst from the ceiling, and the smell intensified, turning into a toxic, acrid haze. David jumped up, glancing at the valve. Seconds were disappearing, and he realized he had spent too much time. He looked at Max, and at the gas filling the space. It could all end right now. No, David thought, feeling the air grow thin. The pit bull in his arms couldn't help, but David couldn't just leave it and go. He moved with the thought that this might be his last chance. The gas filled the room more intensely. Every minute counted. The gas gushed from the pipe with such force that the stream scorched the air. David, slipping on the wet floor, barely avoided falling into the water but managed to grab the pipe. The water in the basement rose quickly, engulfing his boots, and he knew time was running out. He pulled a wrench from his bag, pressed it against the pipe, and began to turn, trying to shut off the gas flow. The pipeline creaked, and the wrench barely gripped the opening. The pressure was too high. He pressed the tool hard, but it wouldn't hold. The gas escaped more violently, hissing and rumbling, filling the basement with an acrid smell. The water had almost reached his chest, and every movement was a struggle. The pit bull, tied to the radiator, sat in the water, unmoving. A faint, almost inaudible whimper escaped its throat, but it didn't try to break free, as if understanding that its life also hung in the balance. David tried not to think about it, but his gaze inevitably fell on the dog. He had to act quickly, but the wrench slipped on the pipe, finding no purchase. Suddenly, as if by fate, the dog came to life. Max leaped from the cabinet shelf with a loud splash and rushed to David. Its paws left tracks in the water as it approached the man, as if knowing this moment was decisive. It took a few quick steps and grabbed a spare wrench that David had tied to his belt with its teeth. The dog lifted it and, with great effort, dragged it to David's feet, then, exhausted, dropped it right before him. David, looking at this gift, felt something inside him change. He grabbed the wrench, turned it in his hands, and finally found the right position. The pipe yielded. With effort, with each turn, he tightened the valve, and the gas stream began to weaken. The gas still hissed, but now David had a chance. He paused for a moment to breathe rare and clean air, but his thoughts returned to the dog sitting opposite him. He couldn't leave it there, and now he had saved it. But his mission was not yet complete. Now he had to find a way to shut off the gas completely, and time was running out again. Water surged, rising higher, a dense mix of water, gas, and steam merging into an unbearable flow. David could barely breathe. The water had reached his chest, the floor slippery, every step like floating. The pipeline roared, the air electric, sparks crackling from overheating. He could hear the building's foundation creaking. The crackling grew louder with each second, the screeching almost unbearable. If he didn't shut off the gas now, the entire structure could explode, and he would vanish with the house. David gripped the pipe and gritted his teeth. His hand slipped, but he couldn't stop, couldn't think about fear. He knew, if he couldn't close the valve, death was inevitable. The water rose almost to his neck. He felt its weight, couldn't suppress the shiver, but kept fighting, trying to balance between the waves and the explosive force of the gas. Every second became critical. He wrapped around the pipe, tightening the wrench on the valve. The pressure pushed back. The wrench slipped, and David couldn't hold it. The water squeezed him, as if trying to engulf him. He rose with his last strength but still couldn't reach the crucial part of the pipe. David looked at the valve. He couldn't turn it, couldn't reach it. Almost no air left in his lungs. Only darkness approached with each minute. He felt his chest tighten, his breath failing to act. The gas, mixing with water, entered his lungs, and David felt himself losing consciousness. Weakness overcame his entire body. His legs gave way, and he sank. His body was engulfed by water, growing heavier with each moment. His vision blurred, and reality faded like a mirage. But at that moment, he heard a familiar sound, the dog barking. The pit bull tugged at his jacket. The bark was desperate, loud, filled with pain and fear. The dog tried to pull him, David could barely make out the sounds, but he felt something tugging at his body, pulling, dragging. Max was there again. Despite its strength, despite the fear, with each tug, the dog became more insistent, as if driven by a command it couldn't disobey. The mechanism hummed. At that moment, the gas stream weakened. The pressure dropped. The water finally receded slightly, and David, pulled by the dog's strength, surfaced. He came to in the darkness. The water was still in the basement, but no longer as threatening. David coughed, the noise in his ears unceasing. He couldn't understand what had happened. His vision was blurry, hazy. His head rang. But when his gaze focused, he realized the valve was closed. The gas no longer escaped, and the pit bull sat beside him. The dog breathed heavily, like David. It pressed against him, as if saying everything was okay. But David was grateful. Without Max, it could have ended differently. He looked around but felt strength returning to his body. His fingers barely closed around the cold wrench. He could hold it again. Seconds that felt like eternity passed, but with each minute, safety returned. The pit bull looked at him with interest, as if asking, "Are you okay?" David nodded, gathering his last strength to stand. The water hadn't receded, but they were alive. It had all been like a nightmare from which they had barely escaped. But now, with the gas stopped and the job done, they returned to life, even in their battered state. David squeezed the dog's shoulder. All he needed was to make it through the night and see the light. "Thank you, Max," was all David said, and the dog accepted his words, as always, without reply. David felt the ground tremble softly beneath his feet as he carefully made his way through the mud and debris outside. The water had receded, leaving only murky puddles and air thick with dampness and gas. The walls of the houses, once nearly swallowed by the flood, now stood like giant, almost lifeless tombs sunken in the earth. The wind, icy and relentless, whipped between the ruins, carrying the sense of wet earth and smoldering gas leaks left by the destruction. David struggled to keep exhaustion at bay. His hands and feet churned more mud than he wanted, but he knew he couldn't give up. He saw rescuers working on the houses, circling the ruined buildings, hoping to find more survivors. But his focus was on one thing, the dog in his arms. The pit bull in his grasp breathed heavily but made no sound. It was shivering, like a frightened shadow, but remained conscious. Stroking its head, David felt its body move, despite all the time spent in the water. The pit bull was alive, and that was all that mattered. Rescuers helped him out, but he held the dog tightly, unwilling to let go despite everything. He kept walking, feeling the stares, understanding that they saw only one moment, a man with a dog in his arms amidst all the chaos. When they returned to a safe place, the houses were almost empty. The police were already inspecting the scene, talking to a few witnesses. At that moment, he noticed the homeowners, the ones who owned the building he had saved. A man and a woman stood by a car, watching the situation intently. But when asked about the dog, they flatly denied knowing anything about it. "We don't know this dog, never saw it," the man said with indifference. David stood, holding the pit bull, feeling his heart race with anger. The dog had been tied to the radiator, but couldn't have been an accident. Piles of ropes and faint marks on the floor indicated it had been in that basement for a long time. Even a veterinary examination confirmed that the dog had been in poor conditions, likely neglected or subjected to cruel treatment. The police couldn't ignore this evidence. A case was opened, and the owner's statements convinced no one. Talks with neighbors, inspection of the apartment, evidence, everything pointed to the contrary. By this time, David felt the weight of everything that had happened finally beginning to lift. He handed the dog over to the veterinarians, knowing it would at least be safe now. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The police continued their investigation, and the homeowners faced potential legal action. The law followed its course, and although David wasn't sure it would lead to justice for the dog, he felt he had done all he could. Seeing the dog gradually recover, he understood. No matter what happened next, it would no longer be alone. A few days passed. David sat in the quiet office of a shelter, filling out a form. The pit bull sat beside him, slightly unsteady on still weak legs. It was clean now, looking much better, its fur neatly trimmed, the dirt gone, but the scars of its ordeal remained. The skin, rubbed raw by the rope, was still visible on its neck, but the vet assured him it would heal. The dog kept looking at David, as if trying to understand what was happening. "This will be your place, Max," David said softly, filling in the last line. The pit bull continued to watch. It was neat and calm, but there was a hint of uncertainty in its gaze. It didn't know what had happened or why it was there, but it followed David's every move. "You know, I wasn't really sure," David added, signing the document. He looked at the dog. "In the end, you chose me." When David stood to hand over the papers, the dog rose and moved closer. He placed his hand on the dog's head. "Max," he murmured, saying its name for the first time, thinking about how they were now a family. A few days later, in the backyard, David stood in an old denim jumpsuit, watching Max race across the grass, its body full of energy. The sun was setting, a warm breeze gently ruffling David's hair, and he couldn't help but throw a ball forward. Max dashed after it, as if his legs were a harness and the ball a target he had to reach at any cost. David knew his life would be a little different now, but it was good. Max picked up the ball in its teeth and brought it back. With a smile, almost imperceptible but present, David threw it again. Max raced off, and David felt a warmth inside. This wasn't just a game. It was a moment when each understood they had found each other. Suddenly, a news report came on the TV in the kitchen corner. Thanks to the actions of a local resident, the destruction of a residential quarter was prevented. David paid it no mind, turned off the TV, and looked back at Max. He knew this moment, this day, was far more important than any news report. Max brought the ball back, its gaze clear and calm, without a word. Everything had already been said.